Between 1933 and 1945, the Third Reich generated millions of classified documents, confiscated the gold reserves of 12 occupied nations, and financed weapons programs that its own archives never recorded. A regime that documented every crime with bureaucratic precision chose in its final weeks to selectively destroy what compromised it the most. The only bone fragment that the Soviets preserved as proof of Hitler's death turned out in 2018 to belong to a woman between 30 and 40 years old. Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo and operational architect of the Holocaust, was seen alive in the Führer bunker on May 1, 1945, and was never again located, tried, nor confirmed dead. In March of that same year, physicists from Operation Alsos dismantled a German nuclear reactor in Haigerloch that was considerably closer to criticality than any Allied intelligence service had estimated. And in the Arctic, a German officer continued transmitting encrypted data from an island 900 kilometers from the North Pole for 4 months after the Reich's capitulation, with a radio power far superior to what was necessary for measuring the weather. This documentary reveals the 15 darkest mysteries of Nazi Germany. The ghost of the Führer. The Führer bunker was not an emergency shelter. It was a 2-story reinforced concrete structure with 40 rooms built under the garden of the Reich Chancellery between 1943 and 1944, with walls 4 meters thick designed to withstand direct bombings. At the end of April 1945, it was also the last functional command center of the Reich. On April 16, 1945, Marshal Georgy Zhukov launched the offensive on the Oder-Neisse with 2.5 million Soviet soldiers. 4 days later, on April 20, Hitler's birthday, Soviet cannons reached Berlin. At that moment, Hitler was still ordering counterattacks with units that had either ceased to exist or had barely dozens of men. General Gotthard Heinrici, commander of Army Group Vistula, ignored several of those orders directly. The official version of what happened on April 30 is supported by numerous eyewitnesses. At 15:30, Hitler and Eva Braun retired to the private study. SS Sturmbannführer Otto Gunscher, Hitler's personal adjutant, was the one who received the instruction not to open the door under any circumstances for at least 10 minutes. When he finally entered, he found Hitler with a gunshot wound to the right temple and Eva Braun dead from potassium cyanide poisoning. Heinz Linger, Hitler's personal valet who had been in his service since 1935, confirmed the details in later interrogations and in his memoirs published in 1980. General Wilhelm Burgdorf and the head of the SS in the bunker, Johann Rattenhuber, were also among the indirect witnesses who confirmed the facts. The bodies were moved to the Chancellery Garden and burned with approximately 200 liters of gasoline, following instructions that Hitler had explicitly given after seeing the images of Benito Mussolini hanging upside down in Milan on April 28. The cremation process was incomplete. The conditions of the active bombing and the amount of fuel available were not sufficient to destroy the remains completely. The Red Army entered the Chancellery Garden on May 2. What they did with the found remains is documented, but in a fragmentary and contradictory manner. Units of SMERSH, the Soviet Military Counterintelligence Service, performed emergency autopsies on several bodies found in the garden. The Soviet forensic report, written on May 8, 1945, identified Hitler's remains based mainly on dental records, confirmed by his dental assistant Fritz Echtmann and by Kater Heusermann, the assistant of Hitler's personal dentist, Johannes Blaschke. That dental identification was for decades the strongest argument for the official Soviet version, but Stalin made the decision not to publish the results. The reason documented in the Politburo archives was explicitly political. The Soviet leader feared that an identifiable grave of Hitler could become a place of neo-Nazi pilgrimage in Germany and Eastern Europe. The result of that decision was that for years the Soviet Union not only did not confirm Hitler's death, but at some official moments denied it, fueling decades of speculation that the Soviet regime had created with its own hands. In 1993, after the collapse of the USSR, the Russian government admitted to preserving remains attributed to Hitler in the FSB archives. Among those remains was a fragment of the frontal bone of the skull, with a hole consistent with an exit gunshot wound, which the Soviets had presented in Russian historical exhibitions as direct evidence of Hitler's death. It was the primary forensic proof. In 2018, the forensic archaeologist Linda Strausbaugh from the University of Connecticut led a team that analyzed the fragment preserved in the FSB archives using mitochondrial DNA sequencing. The result was unequivocal. The fragment belonged to a woman between 30 and 40 years of age. The morphology of the tooth, also analyzed, was inconsistent with the known records of Hitler's dentition. This does not prove that Hitler survived. What it proves is that the only direct physical forensic evidence that the Soviets preserved was not Hitler's, but of an unidentified person. Combined with the destruction or disappearance of the original dental records, Kata Heusermann was detained by the NKVD and spent 10 years in a Soviet labor camp, and her statements in captivity are not independently verifiable. The forensic basis of the official version is considerably weaker than what has been presented historically. The CIA accumulated between 1945 and 1955 more than 700 pages of reports on sightings of Hitler in South America, declassified in 2016. Most are of very low quality, but a report from October 1955, generated by the CIA station in Caracas and classified as CID 28910, describes with precise geographic coordinates the presence of an individual identified as Hitler in the region of Tunja, Colombia, protected by a network of emigrated Germans. The agent rated the source as proven in 3 previous operations. There was no documented follow-up. The German submarines U-530 and U-977 surrendered in Mar del Plata on July 10 and August 17, 1945, respectively, between 2 and 3 months after the official capitulation of the Reich. The commander of U-977, Heinz Schäfer, published in 1950 memoirs in which he denied having transported high-ranking passengers, but the Argentine and American authorities found his explanation of the delay unsatisfactory. No subsequent investigation managed to completely reconstruct the route of both submarines between May and July 1945. The historian Ian Kershaw, whose 2-volume biography of Hitler published between 1998 and 2000 remains the dominant academic reference, concludes that death in the bunker is the scenario with the greatest support in the available sources. The direct testimonies are numerous and consistent. A man of that profile would not have been able to remain anonymous in South America for decades without a verifiable documentary trail. That is the position of the historiographical community. But the direct forensic evidence that would definitively close the debate was destroyed, manipulated, or proved not to be what it claimed to be. And that absence, created in part by Stalin's own decisions, is the space within which the question remains technically open. Project Riese, 9 kilometers of tunnels and a purpose that no one documented. While Mengele fled south through the networks of post-war chaos, in the mountains of Silesia, the Third Reich had left behind something of a completely different nature, a network of tunnels excavated by hand by tens of thousands of prisoners, whose official purpose was never recorded in any document that has survived. Project Riese, in German Giant Project, was initiated in 1943 under the direction of the organization TOT, the Reich's construction agency that had built the Atlantic Wall and the bunkers of the Western defensive system. The project was developed in the Polish Sudets, in a radius of approximately 30 kilometers around the city of Walbrzych in Lower Silesia. It comprised 7 distinct underground complexes with code names such as Flodarts, Osauka, Rozechka, and Jugendstil, totaling more than 9 linear kilometers of excavated galleries. The labor force came from the Gross-Rosen concentration camp, a complex with sub-camps distributed throughout Silesia that during 1944 and early 1945 provided between 13,000 and 15,000 simultaneous prisoners for the excavation. The total turnover of workers throughout the project is estimated at 30,000 people, with a mortality directly attributable to the working conditions that historians from the Gross-Rosen Institute in Rogoznica qualify as extremely high, although the destruction of the camp records prevents quantifying it with precision. What is extraordinary about Project Riese is not its scale, which is comparable to other underground construction projects of the period. What is extraordinary is that the organization taught archives corresponding to Silesia, which would have specified the intended use of the facilities, the institutional client that had ordered them, and the state of progress in January 1945, disappeared completely. The most accepted hypothesis among historians is that they were destroyed by order of the SS in January 1945, when the Soviet advance made it evident that Silesia would fall. Without those documents, the purpose of the project cannot be determined by primary source. The hypotheses that historians have developed from indirect sources range from a complex of alternative headquarters for Hitler or the OKW, to a decentralized weapons production facility far from Allied bombings, and even depots for experimental SS technology. The structure of the complexes, with wide galleries and chambers without identifiable conventional production facilities, is not consistent with conventional weapons factories. The presence of chambers with independent ventilation systems suggests, in some sections, uses that required contaminant control. The most specific testimony about the content of the tunnels is the notarial document granted in 1946 by Tony Stratling and Rudolf Buschke, two engineers from the organization TOT who declared before a notary to have participated in January 1945 in the loading and sealing of a railway convoy with ingots from the Reichsbank, art confiscated from occupied museums and private collections, and classified SS documentation. According to their statement, the entrance to the tunnel where the convoy was stored was sealed with explosives. None of the later excavations has located that convoy. In September 2015, the Polish researchers Piotr Koper and Andreas Richter presented ground-penetrating radar analysis images that supposedly showed the silhouette of an armored vehicle on rails at 9 meters of depth in one of the unexcavated areas of the system. The presentation generated significant international media coverage. The Polish National Geological Institute conducted excavations between 2016 and 2017 at the indicated point and did not find any metal structure. The radar anomalies corresponded to air pockets and variations in the density and moisture of the soil, common geological phenomena in the region. The strongest argument in favor of something remaining unfound in the Riese system comes not from Polish ground-penetrating radars, but from Soviet archives. The NKVD searches in the Silesia region between 1945 and 1947, documented in the archives partially declassified after the dissolution of the USSR in 1991, indicate that the Soviets themselves allocated intelligence resources for at least 2 years to the investigation of possible depots in the area. The Soviets did not have the reputation of wasting NKVD resources on unfounded hypotheses. The SS Bell, the weapon that no one can prove existed. Among all the Third Reich's weapons projects, none generates as much historiographical debate as the one that has no official document to support it. Die Glocke, in English the bell, exists in historical literature thanks to a single primary source, the Polish journalist and researcher Igor Witkowski, who in the year 2000 published in Poland the book Prawda o Wunderwaffe, The Truth About the Miracle Weapon, where he described the device with a level of detail that no captured archive had provided. Witkowski claimed to have accessed, through an unidentified contact within the Polish intelligence services, transcripts of post-war interrogations performed on SS Obergruppenführer Jakob Sporenberg. Sporenberg was the superior SS commander in the Polish general government since 1943 and was tried and executed in Poland in 1952 for war crimes related to Operation Erntefest, the November 1943 massacre in which approximately 42,000 Jews were murdered in the camps of Poniatowa, Troniki, and Majdanek in a single day. He is not an invented character. His post-war interrogations exist. What Witkowski claims to have found in those interrogations is a detailed description of a device named Die Glocke, approximately 2.7 meters in diameter and 4.5 meters in height, made of a metal resistant to high temperatures, containing 2 counter-rotating concentric cylinders filled with a substance called Zerum 525, described as a violet-reddish metallic mercury that had been irradiated. When the device was activated, the electromagnetic field generated produced documented effects on organic materials in a radius of about 200 meters, accelerated decomposition of plant and animal tissues, death of exposed laboratory animals. It is claimed that 5 of the 7 scientists assigned to the program died in the first tests as a consequence of the effects of the field. The installation was the Wenceslaus mine, known in German as Wenceslausschacht, in the Silesia region, in what is currently the municipality of Nowa Ruda in Poland. At the site, there is a ring-shaped concrete structure about 30 meters in diameter, with attachment points on the perimeter, which Witkowski interpreted as the test frame for the device. Comparable industrial structures of the era exist in other facilities in the region without secret implications. The program depended, according to this narrative, on Unit SSE-44, the Entwicklungsstelle 4, which in the organic structure of the SS was the division in charge of the development of alternative energy sources and experimental weaponry. Its existence is documented in captured archives, although its specific projects largely are not. The figure who connects Haigerloch with verifiable historical reality is Hans Kammler. SS Obergruppenführer und General der Waffen SS Hans Kammler was the executive responsible for the Third Reich's most advanced weapons programs from 1944. It was he who oversaw the construction of the underground tunnel system of the V2 rocket plant in Mittelwerk, the Dora Mittelbau complex in Thuringia, where slave workers produced the V1 and V2 rockets. In September 1944, Hitler directly transferred total control of the V2 program to him, taking it away from Werner von Braun himself. From January 1945, Kammler also accumulated control of the Me-262 turbojet-powered fighter programs. He was, in the last months of the Reich, the man with the most real authority over high-technology weapons programs. Kammler disappeared in May 1945. The official version, based on a single witness, is that he committed suicide on May 9, 1945 in Prague. But that testimony was never verified with identifiable remains, and there is no independent documentary record of his death. His name does not appear on the lists of Operation Paperclip, the American program that recruited German scientists, although several of the scientists who worked under his command were indeed incorporated. The German researcher Rainer Kalsch and the American journalist Nick Cook, independently, have argued that Kammler's disappearance was too convenient and too complete to be simply a death without records. Academic historians are unequivocal in their evaluation. There is no document from the Nazi bureaucratic apparatus, and that apparatus was extraordinarily prolific in documentation that mentions Die Glocke as a project name, that records an SSE-4 budget for a device with those characteristics, or that appears in the interrogations of the main German scientists captured by the Allies. The Uhrenverein, Werner Heisenberg's nuclear project, was equally secret and left thousands of internal documents that the Allies captured and study to this day. Die Glocke, if it had the scale described by Witkowski, would have left none. That absence is the most powerful argument against its existence. What persists and what makes the story impossible to completely dismiss with a single sentence is the combination of Kammler's disappearance, the existence of the concrete structure in Silesia, and the proven fact that the Nazi regime financed experimental physics projects sufficiently heterodox to include heavy water moderation, nuclear reactors, delta-wing aircraft, and microwave-guided weapons that the Allies never anticipated. Geli Raubal, the death Hitler never explained. On the morning of September 19, 1931, the housekeeper of the apartment at number 16 Prinzregentenplatz in Munich called the locksmith because the door to one of the rooms had been locked since the previous day. When they opened it, they found Angela Maria Raubal, Hitler's niece, dead on the floor with a gunshot to the left chest. The Walter 6.35 pistol of 6.35mm caliber that belonged to Hitler was on the floor next to her. The story between Hitler and Geli Raubal had begun around 1928, when she moved to the Munich apartment that Hitler shared at that time with his half-sister, Angela Raubal, Geli's mother. Hitler was 39 years old, Geli 20. The exact nature of the relationship was the subject of wide debate among biographers. Ron Rosenbaum, in his 1998 study Explaining Hitler, devotes an entire chapter to analyzing the contradictory testimonies about whether the relationship had a sexual component and of what nature. What the testimonies of people close to the Munich inner circle are consistent in describing is a dynamic of extreme control by Hitler. Geli could not go out alone, her correspondences were reviewed, and her attempts to maintain relationships with other men, including with Hitler's driver Emil Maurice, ended under direct pressure. On the night of September 17 to 18, 1931, before Hitler departed for Hamburg for electoral commitments, several witnesses in the building heard an argument between the two in the apartment. Hitler departed the following morning. That same afternoon, Gailey was found dead. What occurred in the hours following the death was structurally irregular. Before the Munich police could establish a perimeter and process the scene, Rudolf Hess and Joseph Goebbels, the deputy of the Führer and the head of propaganda of the NSDAP respectively, were already in the apartment. The argument was that they were acting as Hitler's representatives in a political crisis of enormous sensitivity. The Munich police commissioner at that time was Heinrich Müller, who was not yet the head of the SS with national power, but was already a senior cadre of the party. The police report concluded suicide without a complete autopsy. The burial was performed in Vienna at the Zentralfriedhof with unusual speed. The forensic irregularities pointed out in later analyses include the position of the wound. The shot was in the left chest, not in the head, which is unusual for a suicide with a pistol, although not impossible. Several reports of the time, including one published in the Viennese newspaper Der Wiener Sonn- und Montagszeitung, pointed out that Gailey's nose showed signs of fracture, possibly consistent with a blow before death. That report was officially denied. Otto Strasser, co-founder along with his brother Gregor of the radical wing of the NSDAP, and who broke with Hitler in July 1930 by publishing the manifesto The Socialists Leave the NSDAP, declared in Swiss exile in 1940 that Gailey had sought him out on several occasions before her death to ask for help to escape Hitler's control, and that Hitler had intercepted a letter from her addressed to a music student in Vienna with whom she had a relationship. Strasser was, by 1940, a declared enemy of Hitler, with personal and political reasons to damage his reputation, which historians point out as sufficient reason to treat his testimony with methodological reservations. However, the structure of the account that Strasser provided in 1940 is consistent with independent testimonies about the character of the relationship. Hitler's reaction upon learning of the death, while he was in a hotel in Nuremberg, was described by witnesses as a functional collapse. It was the secretary Ernst Hanfstaengl who convinced him not to commit suicide at that moment, according to Hanfstaengl himself in his memoirs. Adolf Wagner, Gauleiter of Bavaria, and Gregor Strasser blocked the press coverage for 48 hours to manage the political damage. The moment was critical. In September 1931, the NSDAP had obtained 18.3% in the September 1930 elections and was in full phase of electoral rise. A scandal of this magnitude could destroy the campaign. If Gailey Raubal was murdered, the question that historians cannot answer is by whom and under what circumstances. If it was a suicide, the question is whether it was induced or precipitated by the conditions of that relationship. And if it was an accident, why the scene was treated with such political urgency. 84 years after the facts, without a complete autopsy and with the main witnesses dead for decades, all three possibilities remain technically open. Foo Fighters, the phenomenon that bewildered both sides. On November 23, 1944, the 415th Night Fighter Squadron of the USAAF performed a reconnaissance mission over the Rhine Valley. It was a specialized unit, trained specifically for night operations over enemy territory, with pilots who by definition had experience in reduced visibility conditions and in the type of visual disturbances that night flight generates. In the mission report of that night, several pilots described spherical luminous objects of reddish or orange color that maintained constant relative positions regarding their aircraft for several minutes, matching their speeds and maneuvers before disappearing without a trace. The objects did not open fire, they did not appear on Allied ground radars. The pilots called them Foo Fighters, taking the term from the American comic Smokey Stover, where the protagonist shouted, "Where there's foo, there's fire." The name spread among Allied fighter squadrons with the speed that informal military terms acquire in combat conditions. What makes this phenomenon historically significant and not simply anecdotal is the accumulation of reports. Throughout the following 6 months, reports of almost identical characteristics arrived from the Rhine front, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific theaters of operations. The consistency of the descriptions spherical or discoidal objects, emission of their own light, ability to maintain speed and relative position regarding aircraft in maneuver, absence of aggression, and absence of radar signature led the Allied General Staff to take it seriously as a possible tactical threat. In December 1944, the newspaper Stars and Stripes published the first journalistic article on the phenomenon. The initial operational hypothesis of Allied intelligence was coherent. If the Germans had developed an electromagnetic interference system that could follow Allied aircraft without destroying them, the psychological effect on the pilots and the potential to interfere with navigation instruments made the system a relevant tactical threat. The Luftwaffe had demonstrated a capacity for technological innovation that the Allies had systematically underestimated. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the first operational turbojet fighter in history, had entered service in July 1944 and was technically superior to any Allied aircraft at that moment. Operation Lusty, acronym for Luftwaffe Secret Technology, was launched in the spring of 1945 to capture, analyze and understand German aeronautical technology programs. During the interrogations of Luftwaffe scientists and pilots, the American investigators asked systematically about the Foo Fighters. What they obtained was one of the most bewildering pieces of data of the entire investigation. The German pilots had seen exactly the same objects. The Luftwaffe reports, especially regarding the Eastern Front and over Germany during Allied night bombings, described luminous objects with characteristics identical to those described by American and British pilots. The Luftwaffe pilots were convinced that they were American or British weapons. Neither of the two sides was producing them. That symmetry eliminates the human experimental weapon explanation. The natural alternatives proposed by scientists have limited scope. St. Elmo's fire is a static electrical discharge that can appear on the metal surfaces of aircraft during atmospheric conditions with high electrostatic charge, and it explains some light phenomena on the structure of aircraft. But the reports of objects that maintain constant positions at a distance from the aircraft during periods of several minutes in clear meteorological conditions are not consistent with St. Elmo's fire, which is a contact phenomenon. Illusions due to combat fatigue explain individual observations, not those made simultaneously by multiple pilots in separate aircraft. All the captured Third Reich archives, including those of the experimental weapons program of the SS overseen by Hans Kammler, were analyzed by Operation Lusty without finding any program that could produce those objects. The phenomenon is documented in dozens of official mission reports from the USAAF and the RAF, of an institutional credibility that cannot be dismissed. The explanation, however, does not exist in any known archive. The flight of Rudolf Hess, the peace mission that no one could explain in 76 years. On May 10, 1941 at 17:45, a Messerschmitt Bf 110D took off from Augsburg airfield without a recorded flight plan, without Luftwaffe authorization, and without the documented knowledge of any member of the German High Command. The pilot was Rudolf Hess, whose official title was Stellvertreter des Führers, Deputy of the Führer, the third man of the Third Reich in terms of formal hierarchy after Hitler and Goering. The Bf 110D that he was piloting had been technically modified for long-range flight. Auxiliary fuel tanks had been installed in the bomb bays, which expanded its range to more than 2,000 kilometers. The destination was Scotland. Hess landed with the damaged aircraft near Eaglesham in Renfrewshire, about 20 kilometers south of Glasgow, after a flight of approximately 1,400 kilometers over the North Sea. He identified himself to the Home Guard guards, who captured him with the false name of Alfred Horn, but immediately requested to be brought before Douglas Hamilton, the Duke of Hamilton, who in the British social structure was a peer of the realm with access to the government and known for his moderate positions on the possibility of a negotiation with Germany before 1940. What Hess carried with him was a peace proposal. In his statements to MI6 interrogators in the following weeks, he claimed to have acted on his own initiative and without Hitler's knowledge, to offer the British government a hostilities cessation agreement in Western Europe in exchange for Germany's freedom to act in the East. The strategic logic was transparent. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, would begin exactly 41 days later, on June 22, 1941. Hess knew what was being prepared. Hitler's statement the following day was that Hess suffered from mental disorder and that he had acted under his own hallucinations. The regime published an official communiqué in those terms. That narrative served simultaneously to diplomatically disavow the episode and to prevent the Allies from presenting it as evidence of Hitler's intentions in the East. The British historian John Harris published in 2011, together with co-author M.J. Troe, the book Hess, The British Conspiracy, where he argues with substantial documentation that the flight was not a unilateral initiative of Hess, but the result of an MI6 intelligence operation that had lasted months. According to this hypothesis, agents from MI6's Section D, using the identity of British aristocrats sympathetic to a peace agreement, had established correspondence with Hess since 1940, deliberately cultivating his belief that there existed a faction within the British political and aristocratic establishment willing to negotiate an armistice before the war extended to the east. The real objective of the operation was not any peace agreement, but to lure a senior member of the Nazi government to British territory to extract intelligence on German plans, specifically on the imminence of the attack on the USSR, which MI6 already suspected but could not confirm with its own sources. This hypothesis would explain why the documents on the case remain classified with an unusual length. When Rudolf Hess died in Spandau prison on August 17, 1987, at 93 years of age, most of the archives of his interrogations were still classified. The British government had established classification periods of up to 100 years for part of the material, which meant that it would not be available until the middle of the 21st century. In 2017, the National Archives published a partial declassification, but historians who reviewed the released documents found that many of the most relevant files had been expurgated, pages torn out or redacted with length that exceeds any plausible justification related to the protection of living sources. Richard Evans, the Cambridge medievalist who was an expert defense witness in the Irving versus Lipstadt trial in 2000 and one of the most respected voices in Third Reich history, points out that the classification of 76 years and the length of the redactions in the released documents is consistent with the protection of active intelligence operations, not with the concealment of any secret agreement. But he adds that that does not resolve the fundamental question. If Hess was actively lured by an MI6 operation, the way that operation was designed and executed remains one of the most important intelligence episodes of the Second World War without a complete academic reconstruction. The Uranverein. How close was Germany to having the atomic bomb? The resistance of Dej on Alexandra land was the most literal expression of something that the Reich tried until the last possible moment: to remain operational long enough for some of its technological bets to change the balance of the war. The most extraordinary of those bets, and the one that came closest to producing an unprecedented capacity for destruction, was the nuclear program. The Uranverein, the Uranium Club, was the informal name of the German nuclear program, formally initiated in April 1939, 2 months before Albert Einstein wrote his letter to President Roosevelt, alerting of the danger that Germany might develop an atomic bomb based on the fission of uranium. What Einstein feared was already underway. German physicists had identified the potential of nuclear fission a few weeks after Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann discovered it at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin in December 1938. Werner Heisenberg, Nobel Prize in Physics in 1932 and the most prominent theoretical physicist in Germany, assumed the directorship of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institut für Physik in Berlin in 1942, with direct financing from Albert Speer's Ministry of Armaments. Under his direction, the program worked on 2 parallel lines: the development of a nuclear reactor capable of reaching critical mass, and the separation of uranium isotopes to obtain enriched material. The first line, based on heavy water as a moderator, went furthest. The Allies had an early awareness of the program. Operation Alsos was a scientific intelligence mission launched in 1943 under the general command of Brigadier General Leslie Groves, who was simultaneously the director of the American Manhattan Project, with Colonel Boris Pash as field chief. Its objective was twofold: to capture German nuclear physicists before the Soviets reached them, and to determine to what point the German program had advanced. ALSO's units followed the Allied army through France, Belgium and Germany, arresting physicists, requisitioning laboratories and analyzing facilities. What they found in Haigerloch in March 1945 was the most advanced experimental reactor of the German program. It was located in a cave excavated under the church of the town of Haigerloch in Baden-Württemberg, consisting of a graphite cylinder surrounded by 664 kilograms of metallic uranium cubes submerged in heavy water. The physicists of Operation Alsos dismantled the reactor on April 23, 1945, 3 weeks before the German capitulation. Their technical evaluation was specific. The reactor was significantly closer to reaching criticality than Allied intelligence had estimated before the inspection, but it was not functional as a sustained reactor and was still at a considerable distance from producing the fissile material necessary for a weapon. In June 1945, 10 of the main German nuclear physicists, including Heisenberg, Otto Hahn, Max von Laue, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, and Walter Gerlach, were moved to Farm Hall, a requisitioned mansion in Godmanchester, Cambridgeshire, where MI6 interned them in conditions of relative comfort while secretly recording them for 6 months. The transcripts of those recordings remained classified until 1992, when the British government partially declassified them. The conversations recorded on August 6, 1945, when the BBC broadcast the news of the atomic bomb detonation over Hiroshima, are the most significant document of the historiographical debate on the German nuclear program. Heisenberg's reaction was of genuine incredulity. He spent hours recalculating out loud the critical mass necessary for an implosion detonation, arriving initially at erroneous figures. His initial calculation of the critical mass was several orders of magnitude superior to the correct one, which suggested that he did not know the solution that the physicists of the Manhattan Project had found. That behavior gave rise to the central historiographical debate that remains open 80 years later. The American historian Thomas Powers, in his 1993 book Heisenberg's War, argues that Heisenberg's erroneous figures at Farm Hall are consistent with one hypothesis: that Heisenberg knew how to build the bomb, but deliberately directed the program in a direction that would not lead to a functional weapon, for moral reasons that he never articulated publicly during the war. The historian Mark Walker, in his 1989 study German National Socialism and the Quest for Nuclear Power, reaches a diametrically opposite conclusion with the same evidence. Heisenberg's errors at Farm Hall reflect real errors of calculation that the program committed during the war, which means that the Germans simply did not know what the Americans had discovered. The program failed without sabotage. The Farm Hall transcripts do not resolve that debate because they make both interpretations possible. If Heisenberg did not know the real critical mass in August 1945, that can mean that he could not build the bomb, or that he had deliberately chosen not to work in that direction. The evidence is the same. The conclusion depends on assumptions about Heisenberg's psychology that the documents do not verify. What the archives do allow to be concluded with more firmness is the decision context within which the program was developed. While Germany allocated resources to the Uhrenverein, it simultaneously financed the industrial production of the V-2 rocket under von Braun, which cost more than the entire Manhattan Project in proportion to the German GDP, the Me-262 turbojet fighter program, and the massive production of Tiger and Panther tanks. The dispersion of industrial and scientific resources among short-term incompatible technological objectives is, for many historians, the most parsimoniously correct explanation of why the German nuclear program did not reach a bomb. It was not that the German physicists were less capable than the Americans. It was that the Reich tried to win the war with too many simultaneous technological bets without concentrating the resources that any of them would have required to arrive before the Allies. But that explanation does not completely close the question, because what the Farm Hall archives demonstrate is that, in March 1945, the Haigerloch reactor was closer to criticality than anyone outside Germany knew. If the war had lasted 6 months longer, if the Soviet offensive had been delayed one winter, if the resources assigned to the V-2 had gone to the Uhrenverein in 1943 instead of 1945, the question of whether Germany would have been able to produce a functional nuclear weapon before surrendering becomes more difficult to answer with confidence. Göring's cyanide, how the most guarded war criminal in the world cheated the gallows. Hermann Göring arrived at the Nuremberg trial in November 1945, weighing 120 kilograms, and with a documented dependence on dihydrocodeine that American doctors treated during the months prior to the process. When he took the stand, he was a transformed man. In the months of the trial, he reduced his weight to 80 kilograms and demonstrated an analytical capacity that bewildered the court. The American prosecutor Robert Jackson was one of the most reputed jurists of his generation, the legal architect of the Nuremberg process and future Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. In the days of Göring's cross-examination, between March 18 and 22, 1946, Jackson suffered one of the most documented judicial failures in the history of international law. Göring interrupted him repeatedly, discredited the presentation of documents taken out of context, and in several sessions forced Jackson to withdraw without having established the points he sought. The chronicles of the correspondence present, including that of the journalist Telford Taylor in the New York Herald Tribune and those of the NBC team, described a Göring who seemed to win the debate point by point. The presiding judge, Jeffrey Lawrence, had to intervene on several occasions to limit Göring's responses and restore control of the process to the prosecutor. The result did not change. On October 1, 1946, the International Military Tribunal declared Göring guilty of all charges: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The sentence was death by hanging, set for the early morning of October 16. At 22:44 on October 15, 2 hours and 16 minutes before the scheduled execution, the guards found Göring dead in his cell. He had ingested potassium cyanide. The investigation that followed started from a concrete operational question: the Nuremberg Prison Security Protocol, designed specifically for the defendants of the most guarded trial in history, included regular body searches of the prisoners, periodic review of the cell, and control of all belongings. Göring had been searched on October 11, 4 days before his death. Nothing was found. In his personal luggage stored in the prison, which had passed through at least 12 documented reviews in the custody records since the beginning of the trial, a second intact cyanide capsule was found after his death. What that implies is specific. He not only had one capsule at the moment of dying, but he had at least two, and at least one of them had repeatedly passed through reviews without being detected, which requires active and premeditated concealment, not accidental negligence. The most documented hypothesis involves Lieutenant Jack G. Wheelis, a Texan officer from the 26th Infantry Division assigned to the custody of the defendant's belongings depot. Göring's biographer Leonard Mosley reconstructed in 1974 through testimonies from Wheelis's family that Göring had cultivated a personal relationship with the lieutenant during the months of the trial, sending him items from his personal collection of value, including at least one watch. The question of whether Wheelis was bought, manipulated, or simply careless never had a verifiable answer, because Wheelis died in 1954 without having been formally interrogated on the matter. In 2005, an American veteran of 78 years named Herbert Lee Stivers declared publicly that it was he who introduced the capsule. According to Stivers, a young German woman named Mona, who introduced herself as a friend of Göring, asked him to deliver some pills described as stomach medication to the prisoner. Stivers claimed not to have known that it was cyanide. The American Department of Defense investigated the statement in 2005 and concluded that it was plausible but not verifiable. By that year, all the main actors had died, the capsule did not exist as material evidence, and the custody records of the time were incomplete. How Hermann Göring obtained the cyanide that allowed him to cheat the gallows remains technically an open case. Heinrich Müller, the man who coordinated the Holocaust and evaporated. Of all the Third Reich's war criminals, Heinrich Müller is the only one about whom absolutely nothing is known concerning what happened to him after May 1, 1945. There is no identified body. There is no witness to his death. There is no verified grave. There is only a total absence in the historical record, which in the case of a man of his rank and responsibilities is in itself an extraordinary piece of data. Müller was the SS Gruppenführer und Generalleutnant der Polizei and head of the Gestapo, the Geheime Staatspolizei, since 1939. He was not an ideologue. Before 1933, he had worked as an official for the Munich political police during the Weimar Republic, specializing specifically in the surveillance and repression of communist movements. His entry file into the NSDAP was initially rejected because his internal Weimarer Polizei reports on the Nazi Party were too critical. It was Heinrich Himmler who recruited him to direct the Reich security apparatus precisely for that technocratic efficiency, without any ideological commitment that could complicate the execution of orders. The dimension of Müller's responsibility in the Holocaust is operational in the most specific sense. At the Wannsee Conference on January 20, 1942, convened by Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Security Main Office, it was Müller who received the final solution coordination instructions and who directly oversaw the implementation of the deportation system. The Einsatzgruppenbefehl, the order that activated the mobile action groups for mass executions in the Soviet Union since the beginning of Barbarossa, was signed by Müller. It was also Müller who personally directed the dismantling of the Rote Kapelle, the largest Soviet espionage network in Western Europe between 1942 and 1943, with an efficacy that led to the arrest and execution of more than 117 Soviet agents in Germany, Belgium, France and the Netherlands. The last documented sighting of Müller occurred on May 1, 1945, in the Führerbunker in Berlin, the day after Hitler's suicide. He was seen by several witnesses at that moment in the bunker's communications room. What occurred afterward is a complete vacuum. In 1963, the West Berlin authorities exhumed a grave in the Städtischer Friedhof Neukölln, where it was believed that Müller had been buried. They found 3 corpses. None coincided with Müller's biological profile, neither the height nor the dental characteristics nor any other identifiable marker. One of the corpses wore an SS general's uniform, but its identity could not be determined. The other 2 were not identified either. The grave had been used to bury multiple people in the chaos of the final days of the Battle of Berlin, and Müller was not among them. The connection between Müller and the Soviet intelligence services has roots that precede 1945 and that make the hypothesis of his survival and possible defection historically coherent, not speculative. Between August 1939 and June 1941, during the duration of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Gestapo and the Soviet NKVD maintained direct operational channels for the exchange of information on European communists in exile. Müller personally oversaw those exchanges from the German side. In November 1939, an NKVD delegation visited Berlin specifically to coordinate with the Gestapo the identification of political exiles that both organizations wanted to locate. Müller and his Soviet interlocutors knew each other functionally and had collaborated operationally for almost 2 years. Between 1993 and 2001, the CIA declassified documents that included reports from multiple sources, in different years and from different geographic locations, that situated Müller after 1945 working for the Soviet MGB, the Ministry of State Security that preceded the KGB. The temporal and geographic consistency of those independent sources gives them a methodological weight that exceeds that of uncorroborated individual reports. The CIA's internal analysis, also declassified, evaluated the hypothesis as plausible based on multiple circumstantial evidence. The archives of the MGB and its successor, the KGB, remain largely sealed in Moscow. If Müller survived and worked for the Soviets, the documentation that would confirm it would be in those archives. If that documentation exists, it has not been released. And if it was destroyed, we will never know. Heinrich Müller coordinated the operational infrastructure of the greatest collective crime in 20th century European history and disappeared without a trace the day the regime that built that infrastructure collapsed. He is the only one among the responsible of that level who was never tried, never confirmed dead, and never found. The rest of the mysteries that remain to be examined are equally unsettling, but none involves a man with that specific responsibility and that completely unknown fate. Operation Odessa, the network that no one could prove but that worked. The disappearance of Heinrich Müller was not an isolated phenomenon. It was the most extreme expression of something that occurred on a systematic scale in the months following May 1945. Hundreds of people with direct criminal responsibilities in the Third Reich's apparatus moved through Europe, crossed borders, obtained new identity documents, and reached third countries before any international tribunal could locate them. They did so with an efficacy that implies, at the very least, a network of facilitators with access to resources, consular connections, and logistical experience. The term Odessa was popularized by the British novelist Frederick Forsyth in his 1972 novel The Odessa File, where he used it to describe a clandestine organization of SS veterans with centralized structure and corporate financing. The problem is that that name does not appear in any intelligence document of the time, not in American, British, nor Israeli archives. Simon Wiesenthal, the Austrian Nazi hunter who spent decades identifying and locating war criminals, used the term widely in his public statements, but in his own working documents he recognized that he could never prove the existence of a centralized organization with that name. The historian Gerald Steinacher, in his 2011 research published as Nazis on the Run, reached a conclusion that readjusted the debate. Odessa did not exist as a formal structure with hierarchy, centralized financing, and line of command. What existed was something more diffuse and, paradoxically, more difficult to dismantle. Multiple independent networks with local facilitators that operated in a parallel manner, and that in some cases overlapped without being coordinated. The most documented node of those networks was the Catholic bishop Alois Hudal, rector of the Pontificio Istituto Teutonico Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome, who from 1944 facilitated travel documents to Germans and Austrians, whom he described as victims of denazification. Hudal operated from Rome because in that city there existed something that existed nowhere else in Europe at that moment. The International Committee of the Red Cross issued identity and travel documents for displaced persons, and in the administrative chaos of 1945 and 1946, it did so without systematically verifying the declared identities. The applicant provided a name, a photo, and a story, and in many cases received a valid document to cross borders and embark on ships destined for South America. The verified routes led from Rome to Genoa, from Genoa to Barcelona via contacts with Franco's Spain, and from Barcelona to Buenos Aires, Montevideo, and Santiago de Chile on regular shipping lines. An alternative route passed through Syria, with the support of Arab networks that for different reasons were willing to host Germans with military and intelligence experience. The documented cases are what proved that the system worked, regardless of its degree of organization. Adolf Eichmann, the SS Obersturmbannführer who managed the logistics of the deportation of millions of Jews to the extermination camps, arrived in Argentina in 1950 using Red Cross documents issued under the name of Ricardo Clement. The Mossad located him in Buenos Aires on May 11, 1960, and moved him to Israel to be tried. Josef Mengele left Germany in 1949 using his real documents and arrived in Argentina, where he lived openly under his own name for years before changing identity. Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief in Lyon responsible for the torture and death of Jean Moulin, was located by the German journalist Beate Klaasfeld in Bolivia in 1972, where he had lived under the name of Klaus Altmann since 1951. These three cases share a characteristic. None of these men used the same route, the same facilitators, nor the same documents. What they used was the same system of opportunities that the post-war chaos had created. And that is exactly what makes Steinacher's question so pertinent. If there was no central organization, who coordinated the movement of the at least 800 identified war criminals who managed to leave Europe before being captured? The most honest answer is that no one coordinated it in a centralized manner, and that was precisely what made it so effective and so difficult to dismantle. An organization has a head that can be cut off. A network of distributed networks does not. Pervitin, the Blitzkrieg worked because the German army was drugged. Methamphetamine was legal in Germany in 1938. It was marketed by the pharmaceutical company Temmler-Werke in Berlin under the name Pervitin, and it was sold without a prescription as a stimulant for fatigue and depression. Its civilian popularity was immediate. In the first year of commercialization, Temmler produced more than 35 million tablets. The military potential of the drug was systematically identified by Dr. Otto Ferdinand Ranke, director of the Institut für Allgemeine und Wehrphysiologie, the Reich's Military Physiology Institute in Berlin. In 1939, Ranke performed controlled experiments administering Pervitin to 90 medical students and to a group of volunteer soldiers, measuring the effects on concentration capacity, physical resistance to prolonged effort, and specifically, the ability to maintain cognitive performance under sleep deprivation. The quantitative results of Ranke's study documented that subjects under Pervitin could maintain functional performance levels for 24 to 36 continuous hours that would have been physiologically impossible without the substance. Ranke's report to the Oberkommando des Heeres, the Army High Command, was direct in its operational conclusions. Pervitin would allow motorized units to maintain the pace of advance that the blitzkrieg concept required, but that the biological limits of sleep normally made unsustainable. The blitzkrieg concept was not just a tactical doctrine of tank concentration, it was a bet on reaction speed. If panzer units could advance for 72 hours without the rest breaks that any conventional army needed, the resulting operational tempo would break any defensive line before it could reorganize. The French campaign began on May 10, 1940. In the previous weeks and during the first weeks of the advance, the German army distributed between 35 and 40 million tablets of Pervitin among its troops, a figure supported by the Temmler Werke production records that survived the war. The drivers of the Panzerdivisionen who crossed the Ardennes, a terrain that the French General Staff had classified as practically impassable for armoured formations, did so in many cases after more than 24 hours without sleep, kept in a state of artificial alertness by the methamphetamine. General Erich von Manstein's Army Group A reached the Meuse at Sedan on May 13, barely 3 days after the start of the advance, a rhythm that the original Yellow Plan had not anticipated, and that Allied generals considered humanly impossible to execute with conventional logistical techniques. The future Nobel Prize in Literature. Heinrich Müller, who in 1940 was a 22-year-old infantry soldier on the Western Front, documented it in his family letters. In several missives sent to his family in Cologne between May and June 1940, Boll mentions Pervitin with a naturalness that reflects its complete normalization among the troops, asking his parents to send him more pills in the next package. Those letters, published in 2001 by his son René Boll, are one of the most direct documents on the daily perception of the drug among the soldiers. The medical cost was documented but systematically minimized. Throughout 1940 and 1941, reports from army field doctors began to accumulate cases of induced psychosis, manic states with uncontrolled violent behavior, and collapses due to acute withdrawal in soldiers who had consumed Pervitin for consecutive weeks. The Reich's chief doctor, Leonardo Conti, tried in 1941 to reclassify Pervitin as Opiumgesetz, that is, under the legal regime of controlled narcotics, which would have severely restricted its military distribution. The resistance of the OKH was sufficient to limit the impact of that restriction in operational practice. What turns the Pervitin program into a mystery with unresolved dimensions, beyond the documented and widely known fact of its use, is the systematic destruction of the program's medical archives in the final months of 1945. The Reich's health authorities burned the detailed records of Ranke's experiments, the follow-up studies on long-term effects in combatants, and the documentation on the exact quantities distributed by specific units. The historical reconstruction that the German journalist and historian Norman Ohler performed in his book Der totale Rausch, published in 2015, was possible thanks to the production records of Temmler Werke and partial distribution orders found in the archives of the Bundesarchiv Militararchiv. The full dimension of the program's impact on tactical decisions and on the health of the combatants who suffered it remains unable to be quantified due to the deliberate destruction of medical data. Mengeler's notebooks, the archives that the world has never been able to read in full. Mengele arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau in May 1943 with the rank of SS Hauptsturmführer and was assigned as Lagerarzt, camp doctor of the women's section. He was then 32 years old and had a doctorate in medicine from the University of Frankfurt and a second doctorate in anthropology from the University of Munich, where he had worked under the tutelage of Professor Ottmar von Verschuer, director of the Institut für Ehrbiologie und Rassenhygiene, the State Institute of Hereditary Biology and Racial Eugenics. His role in the selections on the ramp, the railway arrival platform for convoys at the camp, has been documented in dozens of survivor testimonies. Each train that arrived was subjected to a selection on the platform. Individuals classified as fit for forced labor were sent to the barracks. Those classified as unfit, who in most transports included all children under 14 or 15, the elderly and women with small children, were led directly to the gas chambers without passing through the camp's registration process. In the camp statistics, these people never existed. They were not tattooed, they were not registered, they generated no document. Historians' estimates place the total number of people murdered by this mechanism at Auschwitz-Birkenau between 1.1 and 1.5 million. What distinguished Mengele from other camp doctors was his active interest in twins. The program he called Zwillingsforschung, twin research, was a direct continuation of the genetics research lines he had developed with von Verschuer in Frankfurt. Approximately 1,500 pairs of twins passed through his experiments at Auschwitz between 1943 and January 1945, when the camp was evacuated before the Soviet advance. Of those 3,000 individuals, fewer than 200 survived. The experiments documented in survivor testimonies and in fragments of recovered records include dye injections directly into the iris to try to modify eye color, a procedure that caused severe infections and permanent blindness. Amputations of limbs between twins with the intention of sewing the members back together in a crossed manner. Blood transfusions between siblings in different blood groups to study immune system reactions. Deliberate exposure to pathogens to compare responses between genetically identical organisms. The results of these experiments were systematically sent to von Verschuer in Frankfurt in communications that he partially destroyed in 1945 and whose full content was never reconstructed. Before leaving Auschwitz on January 17, 1945, days before the Red Army arrived on January 27, Mengele delivered his personal laboratory notebooks to Hans Sedlmayr, a personal friend of his and an employee of the Mengele & Sohn family company, a manufacturer of agricultural machinery based in Günzburg, Bavaria. Sedlmayr acted for decades as the link between Mengele and his family in Germany, transmitting money and correspondence without being intercepted. Mengele left Germany in 1949 with genuine documents in the name of Helmut Gregor, obtained through the International Red Cross, arrived in Argentina, where he lived openly for years, and moved to Paraguay in 1959, and then to Brazil, where he lived under the name of Wolfgang Gerhard until his death. He died from drowning on February 7, 1979 in Bertioga, state of São Paulo, victim of a cerebrovascular accident while swimming. He was buried in the cemetery of Embu das Artes under the name of Gerhard. His real identity was not confirmed until 1985. The confirmation arrived thanks to Sedlmayr. The Israeli Mossad, which had tried to locate Mengele since the 60s without success, tracked the money movements between the Mengele family and South America for years. In 1985, a joint operation by the German, American and Israeli intelligence services performed a raid on Sedlmayr's home in Günzburg, where they found correspondence that led directly to the grave in Embu das Artes. The exhumation and forensic analysis, with DNA confirmation in 1992 using samples from his son Rolf Mengele, definitively identified the remains. The notebooks that Sedlmayr had guarded for decades were partially recovered in that same operation. The Israeli government preserves them and has not published them in their entirety. The fragments that have transcended through the Nuremberg trials and subsequent forensic investigations confirm the scope of the program, but the complete record sent to Berlin during the war, which would have documented the Zwillingsforschung program with the bureaucratic systematicity that the Nazi apparatus maintained, were destroyed along with the general SS archives in March 1945. The whereabouts of the duplicates that von Verschuer kept in Frankfurt remains unknown. Project Riese, 9 kilometers of tunnels and a purpose that no one documented. While Mengele fled south through the networks of post-war chaos, in the mountains of Silesia, the Third Reich had left behind something of a completely different nature. A network of tunnels excavated by hand by tens of thousands of prisoners, whose official purpose was never recorded in any document that has survived. Project Riese, in German Giant Project, was initiated in 1943 under the direction of the organization TOT, the Reich's construction agency that had built the Atlantic Wall and the bunkers of the Western defensive system. The project was developed in the Polish Sudets, in a radius of approximately 30 kilometers around the city of Wałbrzych, in Lower Silesia. It comprised 7 distinct underground complexes with code names such as Wolodarz, Osauka, Roseczka and Jugendstil, totaling more than 9 linear kilometers of excavated galleries. The labor force came from the Gross Rosen concentration camp, a complex with subcamps distributed throughout Silesia that during 1944 and early 1945 provided between 13,000 and 15,000 simultaneous prisoners for the excavation. The total turnover of workers throughout the project is estimated at 30,000 people, with a mortality directly attributable to the working conditions that historians from the Gross Rosen Institute in Rogoznica qualify as extremely high, although the destruction of the camp records prevents quantifying it with precision. What is extraordinary about Project Riese is not its scale, which is comparable to other underground construction projects of the period. What is extraordinary is that the organization taught archives corresponding to Silesia, which would have specified the intended use of the facilities, the institutional client that had ordered them, and the state of progress in January 1945, disappeared completely. The most accepted hypothesis among historians is that they were destroyed by order of the SS in January 1945, when the Soviet advance made it evident that Silesia would fall. Without those documents, the purpose of the project cannot be determined by primary source. The hypotheses that historians have developed from indirect sources range from a complex of alternative headquarters for Hitler or the OKW to a decentralized weapons production facility far from Allied bombings and even depots for experimental SS technology. The structure of the complexes, with wide galleries and chambers without identifiable conventional production facilities, is not consistent with conventional weapons factories. The presence of chambers with independent ventilation systems suggests, in some sections, uses that required contaminant control. The most specific testimony about the content of the tunnels is the notarial document granted in 1946 by Tony Stratling and Rudolf Buschke, two engineers from the organization TOT, who declared before a notary to have participated in January 1945 in the loading and sealing of a railway convoy with ingots from the Reichsbank, art confiscated from occupied museums and private collections, and classified SS documentation. According to their statement, the entrance to the tunnel where the convoy was stored was sealed with explosives. None of the later excavations has located that convoy. In September 2015, the Polish researchers Piotr Koper and Andreas Richter presented ground-penetrating radar analysis images that supposedly showed the silhouette of an armored vehicle on rails at 9 meters of depth in one of the unexcavated areas of the system. The presentation generated significant international media coverage. The Polish National Geological Institute conducted excavations between 2016 and 2017 at the indicated point and did not find any metal structure. The radar anomalies corresponded to air pockets and variations in the density and moisture of the soil, common geological phenomena in the region. The strongest argument in favor of something remaining unfound in the Riese system comes not from Polish ground-penetrating radars, but from Soviet archives. The NKVD searches in the Silesia region between 1945 and 1947, documented in the archives partially declassified after the dissolution of the USSR in 1991, indicate that the Soviets themselves allocated intelligence resources for at least 2 years to the investigation of possible depots in the area. The Soviets did not have the reputation of wasting NKVD resources on unfounded hypotheses. The Amber Room, 6 tons of art that no one has been able to find. Not everything that disappeared from the Reich was metal convertible into money. Some of the most sought-after objects of the Second World War were irreplaceable for reasons that had nothing to do with their market value. The Amber Room was commissioned in 1701 by King Frederick I of Prussia from the sculptor Andreas Schluter and the Danish master craftsman Gottfried Wolfram as decoration for a room in the Berlin Palace. It was composed of 6 tons of carved Baltic amber distributed in more than 100,000 individual pieces, with a total decorated surface of approximately 55 square meters, combined with Venetian mirrors, mosaics of semi-precious stones, and gold leaf. In 1716, King Frederick William I diplomatically ceded it to Tsar Peter the Great as a gift of alliance, and it was definitively installed in the Catherine Palace in Tsarskoye Selo, 25 kilometers south of St. Petersburg, in 1770, where it remained for 171 years. In September 1941, during the rapid German penetration into the northwest of the Soviet Union, the German 58th Infantry Division occupied Tsarskoye Selo. Soviet curators had tried to dismantle the panels to evacuate them, but the amber, after more than 2 centuries of exposure to temperature variations in the room, had become extremely brittle, and several panels had cracked at the first attempt at dismantling. The decision was to cover them with wallpaper and gauze to disguise them. Specialists from the German Kunstschutz, the Army's art protection unit, identified the panels despite the camouflage and dismantled them in less than 40 hours. On October 13, 1941, 27 crates arrived at Königsberg Castle under the supervision of Alfred Rode, director of the city's municipal museum. Königsberg was at that time the capital of East Prussia and a safe rear area city. The panels were exhibited to the public in the Castle Museum between 1942 and 1943. Starting in 1944, the situation changed radically. The RAF bombing from August 26 to 27, 1944, destroyed 80% of Königsberg's historical centre and set fire to parts of the castle. Rode reported in October 1944 that the panels had survived in the basement and that they were being prepared for their evacuation. What happened with that evacuation is the core of the mystery. Erich Koch, the Gauleiter of East Prussia since 1933, had absolute regional authority over any movement of goods in his territory and repeatedly blocked the evacuation requests presented by the museum curators, arguing that allowing evacuations would damage the morale of the civilian population. Koch was detained by Polish authorities in 1949 in Hamburg, where he lived under a false identity, was tried in Warsaw in 1959, sentenced to death with the penalty subsequently commuted to life imprisonment, and died in Barczewo prison in 1986 at 90 years of age. During all those years of interrogations and trial, Koch consistently denied knowing the whereabouts of the panels or having given specific orders regarding them. Alfred Rode, who would have been the most valuable witness regarding the last known movements of the Amber Room, died of typhus in December 1945 in Königsberg, by then already renamed Kaliningrad under Soviet administration. His colleague Paul Feyerabend, who was also present during the final weeks at the castle, died shortly afterward in circumstances that the Soviet records of the time did not document. The two men who knew with most precision what had occurred with the crates died within the first months after the war, before being systematically interrogated by any investigation. The only material confirmation that something left Königsberg before the end of the war arrived in 1997, when German authorities recovered a semi-precious stone mosaic in Bremen that was part of the decorative set of the Amber Room, in the hands of the heirs of a soldier who had kept it since 1945. That mosaic was not in the original 27 crates recorded in Königsberg. It had arrived there separately. What it implies is that at least part of the set was divided and moved in the final months of the war. The Russian government inaugurated in 2003 a complete reconstruction of the Amber Room in the Catherine Palace, work that cost $11 million and 24 years of craftsmanship by Russian and German restorers. It is a technically impressive recreation. It does not resolve the question about the originals. Schatzgraber, the last German soldier who did not know that the war had ended. While in Central Europe historians searched for amber panels under the rubble of Königsberg and the waters of Lake Toplitz, at the northern end of the world, a German officer remained at his post, fulfilling orders from a state that had ceased to exist 4 months earlier. The reason Germany needed meteorological stations in the Arctic has a precise operational explanation. The low-pressure atmospheric systems that determine navigation conditions in the North Atlantic, and specifically on the routes of Allied convoys between American ports and Great Britain, were typically generated in the Arctic 2 to 4 days in advance. Under normal conditions, the flow of meteorological data from Iceland and Greenland to European climate services would have allowed German meteorologists to make reliable predictions. That flow was cut when Great Britain occupied Iceland in May 1940, and Iceland passed under Allied control. The Kriegsmarine's response was the establishment of at least 12 clandestine meteorological stations in remote Arctic territories between 1941 and 1945. Operated by teams of between 15 and 25 men who transmitted encrypted data with the naval Enigma system. The stations had been established in Greenland, Svalbard, and the Russian Arctic Islands, in locations selected for their distance from any Allied presence and for the practical impossibility of a rapid rescue operation if something failed. The northernmost of those stations was Schatzgraber, in German Treasure Hunter, installed in September 1943 on the island of Alexandra Land, part of the Russian archipelago of Franz Josef Land, approximately 900 kilometers from the North Pole. It was commanded by the meteorologist Wilhelm Dege, with 21 men under his command. The inventory of its communications system, recovered by Norwegian explorers who visited the island in 1951 and documented in the archives of the Tromsø Polar History Museum, showed a radio emission power significantly superior to what was necessary for standard meteorological data transmission, which some researchers interpret as evidence that the station also served as an encrypted communications node for operations that were not related to the weather. In August 1944, a part of the Schatzgräber crew suffered severe trichinosis poisoning from consuming poorly preserved polar bear meat. Several men were incapacitated, and a submarine was sent to evacuate the most serious. Dege and the rest of the crew continued at the station. On September 4, 1945, 4 months and 2 days after the formal capitulation of the Third Reich on May 8, Wilhelm Dege delivered his formal surrender to the crew of the Norwegian seal hunting ship Blasel, which was operating in the area and was the first contact with any vessel that the station had had since the end of the war. Dege technically became the last German officer to formally surrender in the Second World War, not because he had resisted the end, but because no Allied military means had reached his position in the time elapsed since the Reich's surrender. What Dege carried with him were the communications records of the station, which he partially published in his 1954 memoirs. Those memoirs, titled Arktische Raubritter, document the meteorological operations in detail, but are notably evasive regarding the content of the encrypted communications received during the final months of the war. The full inventory of the decrypted messages was never delivered to any court, nor to any archive, and the whereabouts of that material is not documented. The unconfirmed and undismissed hypothesis that Kriegsmarine historians have discussed is that some of the Arctic stations, possibly including Schatzgräber due to its transmission power, served as resupply or communications points for U-boats in transit and as repeaters for operations in the North Atlantic. Without the complete communications records, that hypothesis cannot be verified.